Deep beneath the cobbled streets of Paris, where the sunlight never touches the stone, there is a doorway carved into the rock. Above it, a chilling inscription is etched into the lintel, warning all who approach, "Arrête, c'est ici l'Empire de la Mort." Stop, this is the Empire of the Dead. It is not a figure of speech, nor a poetic metaphor. It is a literal truth. Behind that door lies the final resting place of 6 million souls, arranged in a silent, endless waiting room of bone. Welcome to the dreamscape of history. Dim the lights, settle into the quiet, and let us descend into the dark beneath the earth. The story begins not in the dark, but in the crowded, suffocating light of 18th century Paris. The city was growing, bursting at the seams, and so were its graveyards. The most famous of them, Les Innocents, had been in use for nearly 10 centuries. The ground was so packed with bodies that the soil level had risen 6 feet above the street. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a perfume of death that hung over the market stalls and the bakery windows. It was a ticking clock, a disaster waiting to happen, and in 1780 it finally broke. The basement wall of a house bordering the cemetery collapsed under the sheer weight of the earth, sending a landslide of corpses tumbling into the cellar. The city realized with horrifying clarity that the dead were pushing the living out. They needed a new place to rest, a place where they would never be disturbed again. And so the king looked down. Beneath the city lay miles of ancient, abandoned limestone quarries, a hollow labyrinth waiting to be filled.
The transfer of the bones began in 1786, a grim and solemn parade that took place only under the cover of darkness. Every night, as the city slept, a procession of black-draped wagons would rumble over the cobblestones. They were accompanied by priests holding torches, chanting the service for the dead, their voices echoing off the shuttered windows of the silent houses. Imagine standing there, peering through the crack of a curtain, watching the flickering torchlight pass by. The wagons were piled high, draped in heavy cloth, carrying the remains of generations, kings and peasants, saints and sinners, victims of the plague and heroes of the revolution, all mixed together in a jumble of anonymity. For 2 years, night after night, the wagons rolled towards the quarry entrance at the Tombissoir. The bones were tipped down chutes, cascading into the darkness below, with a dry, rattling sound that must have sounded like heavy rain falling on a tin roof. At first they were just a pile, a chaotic heap of calcium and dust dumped into the void. But down in the tunnels, the air was cool, constant, and still. The humidity was high, preserving the remains in a state of suspended time. The noise of the city above, the shouting of merchants, the clip-clop of horses, the ringing of bells, none of it could penetrate the depth of the limestone. Down here, there was only the sound of footsteps and the dripping of water from the ceiling, counting out the seconds of eternity.
It could have remained a simple bone dump, a hidden shame buried beneath the capital. But a man named Erichardt Tuthure, the Inspector General of Quarries, had a different vision. He did not see a garbage heap, he saw a monument, he saw a sanctuary. In the early 19th century, he began to organize the chaos. He ordered the workers to stack the bones, not just to store them, but to arrange them with artistic precision. The long bones, the femurs and tibias, were stacked like firewood to create massive structural walls. These walls of bone lined the corridors, rising from the floor to the ceiling, a facade of death that stretched for kilometers. And then the skulls. They were placed within the walls of limb bones, arranged in patterns, rows, crosses, hearts, and geometric shapes staring out from the beige tapestry of femurs. It became a museum of mortality. Plaques were added, bearing quotes from the Bible and classical poets, reminding visitors that life is fleeting and that this silence awaits us all. It is a strange, hypnotic beauty. To walk those corridors is to walk through a library where the books are the people of the past. There are no names here, no headstones to mark an individual life. The identity of the individual has been dissolved into the collective. The rich man lies next to the beggar, the executioner next to his victim. In the dark, all distinctions fade away, leaving only the uniform architecture of the human form. There are legends, of course, of those who strayed from the path. The catacombs that are open to the public today are but a tiny fraction, a mere mile or two, of a network that spans over 300 kilometers beneath Paris. It is a maze designed to confuse, a web of identical tunnels turning back on themselves. The most famous cautionary tale is that of Philibert Asper. In 1793, during the height of the French Revolution, Philibert, a doorkeeper at the Val-de-Grâce hospital, descended a hidden staircase into the quarries. He was looking for something, perhaps the legendary secret stash of chartreuse liqueur kept in the cellar, or perhaps he was just curious. He carried a single candle. He never returned. His body was not found for 11 years. He was discovered in 1804, just a few feet away from an exit he had failed to see in the dying light of his candle. He was identified only by the keys to the hospital hanging from his belt. They buried him where he lay, erecting a small stone pillar that stands there to this day, deep in the forbidden zone of the tunnels, a lonely sentinel in the empire of the dead. Today, the city of Paris bustles above. The metro rumbles, the cafes are full, the lights of the Eiffel Tower sweep the sky. But beneath their feet, in the cool, damp silence, the 6 million remain. They are the foundation of the city, literally and metaphorically. They are the silent majority, watching from the dark, waiting for the day when the stone above cracks and the sunless world reclaims its own. The year is 1963, in the province of Nevşehir, Turkey. A local man is renovating his home, a modest stone house sitting on the dusty surface of the Cappadocia region. He takes a sledgehammer to a wall in his basement, intending to expand his storage space. The hammer strikes, the plaster cracks, and the stones give way. But instead of dirt or solid rock, he finds a void. A cool, stale breeze drifts out from the darkness behind the wall. It smells of earth and something ancient. He peers inside, lighting a match, and sees a tunnel carved perfectly into the soft volcanic rock, sloping downwards into the black. He steps through, thinking perhaps he has found an old storage cellar or a forgotten tomb. He has no idea that he has just stepped into the largest unearthed subterranean city in the world. This is Derinkuyu. He follows the tunnel, and it leads to another room, and then another.
A staircase winds down, cutting through the bedrock. He descends, passing doorways, halls, and chambers. It is not just a cellar, it is a labyrinth. The air gets colder the deeper he goes. He is walking through a ghost town that has been sleeping beneath his kitchen floor for centuries, waiting for the light to return.
As archaeologists descended into the void, the scale of the discovery shattered their understanding of history. This was not a hideout for a few families, it was a metropolis. Dreamscape plunges 18 stories deep into the earth, reaching a depth of nearly 300 feet. It was a complex engineered to sustain life indefinitely without ever seeing the sun. In its prime, this stone hive could house 20,000 people. Imagine that, the population of a large town packed into a vertical ant farm of rock. They brought everything with them. The upper levels were stables for livestock, so the smell of manure would not drift down to the living quarters. There were wine presses, oil storage rooms, refectories for dining, and cellars filled with grain. But the true genius of the city lay in its lungs. The builders dug massive ventilation shafts, over 50 of them, piercing all the way from the surface down to the water table at the very bottom. These shafts allowed fresh air to circulate deep into the belly of the earth, ensuring that even 18 floors down, the people would not suffocate. Standing at the bottom, looking up, that tiny circle of light at the top of the shaft was their only connection to the world above, a distant star in a sky of stone.
But why? Why build a city in the dark? Why choose a life of shadows? The answer is fear. Dreamscape was not a home by choice. It was a bunker. It was built by early Christians fleeing the persecution of the Roman Empire, and later used to hide from Arab raiders. It was a city born of the terror of what walked in the sunlight. The architecture of Dreamscape is paranoid. The tunnels are intentionally narrow, forcing invaders to walk single file, making them easy targets. The ceilings are low, forcing them to crouch. And at every strategic intersection there were the doors. These were not wooden doors that could be burnt or battered down. They were massive, round millstones, weighing over 1,000 pounds. They could only be rolled shut from the inside. Once that stone was rolled into place, the tunnel was sealed. The city became a fortress. Small holes were carved into the center of the millstones, not for looking out, but for thrusting spears through the eyes of anyone trying to push the door open. It was a brutal, claustrophobic defense. Life down there, during the sieges, must have been a psychological nightmare. Weeks, perhaps months, of living in the twilight of oil lamps, the smoke from the torches blackening the ceiling, the constant bleating of animals in the stalls above, the hushed prayers in the underground chapels. Yes, they even built a church. On the lowest levels, there is a cruciform church carved directly into the rock. Even in the dark, they needed a place to believe that there was a light somewhere. Imagine the silence when the enemy was above. 20,000 people holding their breath, listening to the muffled thud of horses' hooves on the ground 300 feet above their heads. They were safe, but they were buried alive. The stone walls were their protection, but they were also their cage. Eventually, the raiders would leave. The millstones would be rolled back. The people would emerge, blinking, their skin pale, their eyes sensitive to the glare of the sun they hadn't seen in months.
They survived the sunless world, but one has to wonder, when they slept in their beds above ground that night, did they dream of the sky, or did they dream of the safety of the rock?
In the late 18th century, Edinburgh was a city of two faces. On the surface, it was the Athens of the North, a beacon of the Scottish Enlightenment. Architects and philosophers walked the wide, paved streets of the new town, discussing reason and logic. But beneath their feet, quite literally, festered a wound that the city tried desperately to ignore. To connect the old town to the university, the city built the South Bridge in 1788. It was a marvel of engineering, a massive stone viaduct spanning the Cowgate Valley. But a bridge is not just a road, it is supported by arches. 19 massive stone arches, to be precise. And within those arches, hidden behind the facade of the bustling shops above, rooms were created. Originally, these vaults were intended for businesses, cobblers, wine merchants, and storage for the tradesmen above. But the bridge had a flaw. It was not waterproof. When it rained in Scotland, which is to say, constantly, the water seeped through the road, filtering down through the stone and dripping into the vaults below. The businesses fled the damp, abandoning the dark chambers. But in a city teeming with poverty, no space remains empty for long. As the respectable businesses moved out, the desperate moved in. The vaults became a subterranean slum, a city of the damned, located directly beneath the feet of the wealthy elite.
Descend into the vaults today, and you can still feel the suffocating weight of the air. But in the 1840s, this place was a hive of humanity. Entire families lived in these windowless stone cells. There was no sunlight, no ventilation, and no sanitation. The only water available was the filth dripping from the ceiling or the waste flowing in the gutters outside. It was a place of perpetual night. Oil lamps were expensive, so many lived in total darkness. Imagine raising a child in a room where you cannot see the walls. Imagine the sound of coughing echoing endlessly against the wet stone. Disease ran rampant. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis thrived in the damp air. The population here was a mix of the tragic and the terrifying. Irish immigrants fleeing the famine, Highlanders displaced by the clearances, and the criminal underworld of Edinburgh. They were the people the city above did not want to see, and so they put them in a stone box and forgot about them. It was said that you could be born in the vaults, live your entire life in the vaults, and die in the vaults without ever seeing the sky.
In the dark, morality begins to blur. The vaults became a haven for illegal activity. Illegal taverns, known as shebeens, operated in the shadows, serving raw whiskey to numb the misery. Gambling dens and brothels flourished. But there are darker whispers associated with these tunnels. This was the era of the resurrection men, the body snatchers who dug up fresh graves to sell to the medical schools. The infamous duo, Burke and Hare, operated in this district. Legend says they hunted in these vaults, preying on the isolated and the forgotten. In a place where no one had an address and no one kept records, a person could vanish into the shadows and no one would ever ask where they went. The vaults were a perfect hunting ground. Who would miss a beggar in the dark? Who would report a scream in a place where everyone was screaming? The stone walls absorbed the sound, just as they absorbed the water. The vaults became a silent accomplice to the crimes of the city.
By the mid-19th century, the conditions became too horrific even for the hardened city council. The vaults were officially condemned, but they weren't just closed, they were erased. The city dumped tons of rubble into the chambers, filling them with debris to prevent anyone from returning. They sealed the entrances, and for over 100 years, the vaults were forgotten. They became a myth, a spooky story to tell children. But in the 1980s, a former Scottish rugby player named Norrie Rowan discovered a tunnel leading into the bridge. He began to excavate, hauling out the rubble by hand. As he cleared the rooms, he found the remnants of the lives left behind: toys, medicine bottles, cracked plates, and oyster shells, the cheap food of the poor. Today, the vaults are open again, but the atmosphere remains heavy. Visitors report sudden drops in temperature, the sensation of hands grabbing their ankles, and the sound of footsteps when no one is there. It is said that stone has a memory, and if that is true, the South Bridge vaults remember everything. They remember the cold, the hunger, and the crushing weight of the world above. On the rainy coast of the Pacific Northwest lies the city of Portland, Oregon. In the late 19th century, it was a rough, bawdy port town known as the Forbidden City of the West. Ships from all over the world docked in the Willamette River, hungry for timber and grain. But they were also hungry for something else: men. Life at sea was brutal, dangerous, and poorly paid. Sailors deserted in droves the moment they touched land. This created a crisis for the ship captains. They had cargo to move, but no one to move it. To fill the empty bunks, a dark and predatory industry was born. It was called crimping, but the world knows it better by the name of the destination where the victims often ended up: Shanghaiing. Beneath the saloons, the hotels, and the gambling halls of Portland's Old Town, there lies a network of brick-lined tunnels. These are the Shanghai tunnels. Today, they are a tourist curiosity, but 150 years ago, they were a highway for human trafficking. They connected the basements of the businesses directly to the waterfront. A man could enter a bar on First Street and disappear from the face of the earth, only to reappear weeks later, broken and bruised, halfway across the Pacific Ocean.
The method was terrifyingly efficient and chillingly mechanical. The crimps, the men who ran this underground trade, were paid blood money for every body they delivered to a captain. It didn't matter if the man was a willing sailor or a farmer or a banker who had just stopped in for a drink. Stories are whispered of the deadfalls. These were trapdoors built into the floors of the saloons. An unsuspecting victim would stand at the bar, perhaps enjoying a complimentary drink, but the drink was laced, spiked with opium or chloral hydrate, a Mickey Finn. As the drugs took hold and the room began to spin, the bartender would pull a lever. The floor beneath the customer's boots would drop away. The victim would plummet through the trapdoor, landing on a pile of mattresses or sawdust in the tunnel below. The trapdoor would slam shut, the sawdust would be swept over the cracks, and the music would play on. The patron hadn't just left the bar. He had fallen out of the world.
Down in the tunnels, it was a holding pen. The victims were dragged into small, barred cells, often kept in the dark for days, waiting for a ship that was ready to set sail. They were stripped of their clothes, their boots, and their identity. One of the most notorious kings of this underworld was a man named Bunko Kelly. He was a predator with a twisted sense of humor. Legend has it that one night he found a cellar filled with men who had broken in and died of consuming formaldehyde, thinking it was alcohol. Kelly reportedly didn't let the tragedy go to waste. He sold the corpses to a ship captain as dead drunk sailors, collecting his fee before the captain realized his new crew would never wake up. Whether that specific story is true or folklore, it illustrates the value of life in the Shanghai tunnels. A man was just cargo, meat to be traded for gold. The tunnels echoed with the groans of the drugged and the weeping of the kidnapped, men realizing that their lives as they knew them were over.
The horror of the Shanghai tunnels wasn't just the kidnapping, it was the awakening. Imagine the psychological break. You are having a drink in a warm pub in Oregon. The next thing you know, you are waking up to the spray of salt water, the pitching of a deck, and the shouting of a bosun. You are miles from land. You have signed a contract you don't remember seeing. You are legally bound to the ship for a voyage that could last years. If you refuse to work, you were beaten or thrown overboard. The tunnels were the birth canal into a life of slavery. Many never returned. They died of scurvy, storms, or accidents in foreign ports. Their families in Portland were left wondering, staring at the river, never knowing that their father, brother, or son hadn't run away, but had been swallowed by the city itself. The tunnels are mostly blocked off now, filled with rubble and the dust of time. But if you walk the streets of Old Town Chinatown at night, and you hear the hollow thud of your footsteps on the pavement, remember that you are walking on the roof of a prison, a place where the floor was a trap and the exit led only to the sea.
It began with a mistake, a simple, mundane chore that triggered an apocalypse in slow motion. The year was 1962. The place was Centralia, Pennsylvania, a small, tight-knit coal mining town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a place of porch swings, corner stores, and hard-working families. On a warm Sunday in May, just before Memorial Day, the town council decided to clean up the local landfill. It was an illegal dump site, an eyesore located in an abandoned strip mine pit. They hired volunteer firefighters to set the trash on fire, burn it down to ash, and then extinguish it with water. It was a routine procedure. They had done it before. But this time, something went wrong. The firefighters doused the visible flames, but deep at the bottom of the pit, an ember survived. It found a crack in the rock, a doorway into the darkness. That crack led directly into a labyrinth of abandoned coal mines that crisscrossed beneath the entire town. The ember met the coal, and the coal, rich, black and volatile, began to burn. It wasn't a roaring fire, it was a smoulder, a slow, creeping infection spreading through the veins of the earth. The town went to sleep that night, thinking the job was done. They didn't know that they had just lit a fuse that would never go out.
At first, the signs were subtle. People complained of a foul smell, a sulphurous stench like rotten eggs drifting up from their basements. In the winter, the residents noticed something strange. The snow didn't stick to the ground in certain patches. The earth was warm to the touch. Vegetation began to die. The grass turned brown, and the trees withered, their roots baked by the heat radiating from below. But the most terrifying symptom was the gas. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer,
began to seep up through the soil. It filled basements and schools. The town was sitting on top of a blast furnace. The fire was moving, crawling through the tunnels, chasing the oxygen. It was a subterranean dragon, breathing smoke through cracks in the pavement. The roads began to buckle and warp, the asphalt melting from the bottom up. Yet the people stayed. It is hard to believe that the ground beneath your feet is your enemy. They bought gas monitors, they kept their windows open, and they prayed the fire would burn itself out. It didn't.
The turning point came on Valentine's Day, 1981. A 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was playing in his grandmother's backyard. He spotted a wisp of smoke rising from the ground near a tree. Curious, he walked over to investigate. Suddenly, the earth opened up. A sinkhole, 4 feet wide and 150 feet deep, collapsed beneath his feet. He fell, screaming, plunging into the hot, muddy darkness. He grabbed a tree root on the way down, clinging to it for his life. Below him, the ground was churning. A plume of hot, toxic gas billowed up around him. The carbon monoxide levels in that hole were lethal within minutes. He screamed for help, and miraculously, his cousin heard him. He was pulled to safety, his clothes covered in warm mud. When the experts measured the temperature in that hole, it was over 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The reality could no longer be ignored. The town wasn't just sick, it was being devoured. The fire wasn't just under the mines anymore, it was under the swing sets, the kitchens, and the bedrooms.
Following the incident, the government finally stepped in. They realized the fire could not be fought. They had pumped water, fly ash, and sand into the mines, but the fire just laughed. It was too deep, too vast. The only solution was retreat. In 1984, Congress allocated $42 million to buy out the residents. Most took the money and left, watching as their childhood homes were bulldozed into the dust. The zip code, 17927, was revoked. The town of Centralia was officially erased from the map. Today, it is a modern ghost town, a grid of empty streets overgrown with weeds, leading to driveways that end in nothing. A few stubborn residents refuse to leave, living in the handful of remaining houses, surrounded by silence. But the fire is still there. If you visit today, you can see the smoke rising from the ground in the graveyard, curling around the headstones. Experts say there is enough coal down there to keep the fire burning for another 250 years. It is a slow, silent disaster. A permanent reminder that once we open the door to the sunless world, we cannot always close it again.
In the dry, dusty spring of 1974, in the Shanxi province of China, a group of farmers were battling a drought. They went out into the fields beneath the shadow of Mount Li, hoping to dig a well to water their pomegranate orchards. They dug down, meter by meter, into the red earth. Their shovels hit something hard, not stone and not water. It was terracotta. They cleared away the dirt, expecting perhaps an old bowl or jar. Instead, they found a face sculpted from clay, life-size, staring back at them with an expression of stoic calm. They had not struck water, they had struck the edge of an army. What they uncovered was the eighth wonder of the world, the terracotta army. But this was merely the outer defense, the perimeter guard for something much larger and much darker. They had stumbled upon the necropolis of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. A man so obsessed with immortality and so terrified of death
that he spent 38 years building a subterranean copy of his empire so that he could rule the sunless world just as he had ruled the one above.
The scale of the discovery is numbing. Over 8,000 soldiers have been found, and yet the central tomb remains untouched. The soldiers stand in formation, row upon row upon row, in trenches buried deep beneath the soil. Walk among them, and you will see that no two faces are alike. Some are old, some are young. Some have topknots, others have caps. Each one was modeled after a real human being, a real soldier who lived, breathed, and perhaps died for the emperor 2,000 years ago. They were once painted in bright colors, red, green, purple, but when they were exposed to the air, the paint peeled away in minutes, leaving them as grey ghosts. They are waiting. They hold bronze weapons, swords that are still sharp enough to split a hair, crossbows with triggers that still click. They are facing east, towards the conquered kingdoms, ready to defend their emperor from the spirits of the enemies he slaughtered in life. It is a silent, frozen war room held in a breath of suspended animation.
But the soldiers are just the guardians. The true mystery lies a mile to the west, beneath a massive, man-made pyramid of earth covered in trees. This is the emperor's actual tomb, and for over 2,000 years, no one has entered it. Ancient historical records, written by the grand historian Sima Chan a century after the emperor's death, describe what lies inside. He wrote that the tomb is a microcosm of the universe. The ceiling is painted with the constellations of the heavens, using pearls for stars. The floor is a map of the empire, with mountains and valleys modelled in bronze. But the most chilling detail is the water. The historian wrote that the emperor created reproductions of the two great rivers of China, the Yangtze and the Yellow River, and the Great Ocean. But they were not filled with water. They were filled with mercury, flowing mechanically, driven by machinery to circulate forever in a toxic, shimmering cycle. For a long time, this was thought to be a legend, a poetic exaggeration. But in recent years, scientists inserted probes into the soil of the burial mound. The results were terrifying. The mercury levels were 100 times higher than naturally occurring levels. The rivers are real.
Why have we not opened it? Why do archaeologists hesitate to dig into the mound? It is partly out of respect and fear of damaging the artifacts, but there is also the fear of what was left behind to protect the emperor. Sima Qian wrote that the tomb is rigged. He described mechanical crossbows mounted at the entrances, tensioned and ready to fire. He warned that anyone who dared to break the seal would be met with a volley of arrows. Could wood and bronze mechanisms survive for 2 millennia? It seems impossible. But the bronze swords of the soldiers outside were chrome-plated, a technology thought to be invented in the 20th century, yet used here in ancient times. If they could preserve a blade, could they preserve a trap? So the emperor sleeps. He lies in his palace of darkness, beneath a sky of pearls, surrounded by flowing rivers of silver, guarded by a mechanical death. He constructed a sunless world so complete, so toxic, and so defended that even today, with all our modern technology, we are afraid to knock on his door.
High in the Bolivian Andes, at an altitude where the air is thin and the wind screams like a banshee, stands a mountain. It is called Cerro Rico, the Rich Mountain. In the 16th century, it was the bank of the world. It was the source of the Spanish Empire's silver, the wealth that funded wars, built armadas, and decorated the cathedrals of Europe. The city that grew at its foot, Potosi, was once one of the largest and richest cities on earth, rivaling London and Paris. The streets were said to be paved with silver bars. But while the city above glittered with opulence, the world inside the mountain was a different story. The indigenous people called the mountains something else, the mountain that eats men. To enter the mines of Potosi was to enter a mouth that rarely opened to let you back out. The Spanish colonialists instituted a system called La Mita, a mandatory draft of forced labour. Thousands of men were marched from hundreds of miles away, chained together, destined for the darkness. They were sent into the mountain carrying nothing but a leather bag for the ore and a tallow candle. They would climb down rickety ladders made of twisted leather, descending hundreds of meters into the stifling heat. The temperature difference was brutal. Outside, the freezing Andean wind could kill you in minutes. Inside, the heat was so intense that men worked naked, their bodies slick with sweat and black dust.
The conditions were apocalyptic. The tunnels were narrow, unstable, and unventilated. The air was thick with silica dust, a fine powder that coated the lungs and slowly turned them to stone. They called it miner's sickness, what we know today as silicosis. It was a slow, suffocating death sentence that claimed you even if the mountain didn't collapse on you first. The workers, known as mitayos, would often stay underground for a week at a time without seeing the sun. They slept in crevices, ate meager rations, and chewed coca leaves to numb the hunger and the exhaustion. Imagine the darkness. The only light came from the flickering tallow candles attached to their foreheads or fingers. If a candle went out, a man could be lost in the labyrinth forever. The silence was broken only by the sound of picks striking rock, the groans of men hauling sacks of silver weighing over 100 pounds up vertical shafts, and the occasional rumble of a cave-in that would snuff out a dozen lives in an instant.
In such a hopeless place, faith changes. The miners believed that God reigned in the sky above, in the blue heavens and the bright sun. But underground, deep in the crushing dark, God had no power. The underground belonged to someone else. They called him El Tío, the uncle. He is the lord of the underworld, a figure synonymous with the devil. To survive the shift, you did not pray to the Virgin Mary, you prayed to him. In every gallery and tunnel of the mine, there is a statue of El Tío. He is fashioned from clay and mud, a horned, demonic figure with wide eyes and a voracious mouth. He is not a symbol of evil to be rejected, but a landlord to be appeased. Every day, the miners would make offerings. They would light cigarettes and place them in his clay mouth. They would pour pure alcohol onto the ground before him and scatter coca leaves at his feet. It was a transaction. I give you this offering, you allow me to leave your mountain alive today. If you ignored El Tío, he would get angry. And when El Tío got angry, explosives would detonate too early, rocks would fall, and the mountain would eat. History tells us that Potosi produced 41,000 metric tons of silver, but the cost was staggering. Historians estimate that millions of people died in the mines of Cerro Rico over the colonial period. There is a saying that you could build a bridge of silver from Potosi to Madrid,
but you could build a bridge of bones right back alongside it. The silver from this mountain circulated the globe, becoming the pieces of 8 used by pirates and the currency of the Ming dynasty in China. The modern world economy was born in these dark, suffocating tunnels. Today, the mountain is still mined. It is a hollow shell riddled with so many thousands of tunnels that it is structurally collapsing on itself. It is a sinking cone of red dust, and yet men still go in. They still descend the leather ladders, they still chew the coca leaves, and they still sit in the dark before the clay statue of the devil, lighting a cigarette for him, hoping that today is not the day the mountain decides to feed.
Beneath the port city of Odessa on the coast of the Black Sea lies a nightmare of geography. While Paris has its neat, stacked ossuaries and Rome has its religious crypts, Odessa has chaos. It is home to the largest network of catacombs in the world. They stretch for an estimated 2,500 kilometers. To put that in perspective, if you laid the tunnels out in a straight line, they would reach from Odessa to Paris. But they are not a straight line. They're a tangled, knotted ball of yarn made of stone. These tunnels were not built with a plan. In the 19th century, the city was booming. Builders needed cheap stone to construct the mansions and palaces above. They found it in Coquina, a soft, yellow shell rock that sits beneath the city. Anyone with a shovel and a basement could start digging. It was a free-for-all. Landowners dug horizontally, miners dug vertically, and smugglers dug secretly. There were no maps, no regulations, and no communication. The result is a multi-level, 3-dimensional sponge of limestone that is structurally unsound and geographically impossible to navigate. It is a labyrinth that was never meant to be solved.
Because the tunnels were unmapped, they became a kingdom of the lawless. In the Victorian era, while the aristocracy drank tea in the salons above, the catacombs became a subterranean highway for crime. Smugglers were the kings of the dark. They moved everything through the stone veins of the city: wine, silk, gold, and slaves. They created hidden exits inside shops, taverns, and even wealthy estates. A thief could steal a purse on the boulevard, duck into a cellar, and vanish into a world where the police dared not follow. The police of Odessa knew that entering the catacombs was a death sentence. The smugglers knew every twist, every dead end, and every drop-off. To chase a criminal into the dark was to volunteer to become a missing person. It was a state within a state, a sunless jurisdiction where the only law was the law of the knife and the lantern.
But the catacombs' darkest and most heroic chapter came during the Second World War, when the Nazis and their Romanian allies occupied Odessa in 1941. The Soviet army retreated, but they left thousands of partisans behind. These men and women moved into the walls. They lived underground for months, sometimes years, without surfacing. They turned the limestone caves into barracks, hospitals, and armories. They built kitchens with intricate chimneys that filtered the smoke through miles of porous rock so the Nazis wouldn't spot the vents on the surface. Life down there was a psychological war. The darkness was absolute. The partisans suffered from caisson disease, malaria, and vitamin deficiencies. They played chess in the flickering candlelight, listening to the boots of the enemy soldiers walking on the pavement 20 meters above their heads. The Nazis tried everything to flush them out. They threw poison gas canisters down the shafts. They poured concrete into the entrances. They even flamethrowered the tunnels.
but the network was too vast. The partisans would simply retreat deeper into the infinite maze, popping up miles away to ambush a convoy before disappearing back into the earth.
Today, the war is over, but the danger remains. The Odessa catacombs are still wild and mostly unmapped. While a small section is open to tourists, the vast majority is a no-go zone. Yet, curious explorers, thrill-seekers, and rebellious teenagers still break in. There is a tragic modern legend associated with these tunnels. It is the story of a New Year's Eve party in 2005. A group of local students went into the tunnels to celebrate, drinking and dancing in the cold stone halls. In the confusion, a young girl allegedly wandered away from the group. She didn't go far, perhaps just a few turns. But in a fractal maze, a few turns is an eternity. Her flashlight battery would have died eventually, and then the darkness would have been total. In the Odessa catacombs, there is no ambient light. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. There is no sound but the dripping of water. The story goes that her body was not found for 2 years. She was discovered by explorers curled up in a remote tunnel miles from the entrance. Whether this specific tragedy is fact or folklore is debated, but it serves as a chilling reminder. The infinite maze does not care if you are a soldier, a smuggler, or a student. It only asks for one mistake, and then it keeps you forever.
If you look at a map of London today, you see the great winding serpent of the River Thames cutting the city in half. But if you were to look at a map from Roman times or even medieval times, you would see something very different. You would see a city of rivers. Tributaries, brooks and streams flowed down from the hills, sparkling in the sunlight, feeding into the Thames. Where did they go? They did not dry up, they did not vanish. They were murdered. As London grew into an industrial monster in the 18th and 19th centuries, these rivers became obstacles. They became dumping grounds for the city's waste, turning from fresh water into open sewers of black sludge. The smell became unbearable, and the land was needed for buildings. So, the Victorians did what they did best. They built over them. They encased the rivers in brick arches, burying them alive. Today, they still flow beneath the feet of millions of Londoners. The River Fleet, once a mighty waterway that carried ships, now rushes silently through a dark tunnel beneath the cellars of pubs and newspapers on Fleet Street. The Tyburn, a river that once witnessed public executions, now flows secretly beneath the bedrock of Buckingham Palace. They are the ghosts of the landscape, trapped in a prison of masonry.
By the mid-19th century, the situation had become apocalyptic. The city was drowning in its own filth. The buried rivers were overwhelmed, spewing their contents back into the Thames, which effectively became a dead, fermenting cesspool. In the summer of 1858, the heat wave struck. The smell coming off the river was so solid, so physical, that it was named the Great Stink. It was said that the fumes could turn silver black in minutes. Men on the riverboats fainted. Parliament, located right on the riverbank, had to soak their curtains in chloride of lime just to breathe, and eventually they were forced to flee the building. The city realized that if they didn't conquer the underground would kill them. Enter Sir Joseph Bazalgette, the civil engineer who would become the architect of the underworld. He designed a massive, intricate network of intercepting sewers, 82 miles of main tunnels,
and over 1,000 miles of street sewers. These were not just drains, they were cathedrals of brick. Bazalgette used over 300 million bricks, creating vast, vaulted tunnels with an aesthetic beauty that no one would ever see. He built an underground city designed for waste, a masterpiece of engineering that saved London from cholera but created a new, dark world beneath the pavement.
This new subterranean world spawned a new breed of human. They were called the Toshers. These were the scavengers of the sewers, men who made their living wading through the dark, toxic rivers of night. Dressed in heavy canvas coats, with lanterns strapped to their chests and poles to test the depth of the sludge, they hunted for treasure. They were looking for tosh, copper coins, silver spoons, bits of metal or jewelry that had been washed down the drains and sinks of the wealthy houses above. It was a profession of extreme danger. The sewers were not just dirty, they were deadly. There were pockets of methane gas that could explode at the strike of a match. There were tides of filth that could rush down a tunnel after a rainstorm, sweeping a man away into the blackness. And then there were the rats. Legends speak of the queen rat and huge colonies of rodents that would attack a lone man if he fell. There was even a persistent urban legend of a breed of black swine, feral pigs that supposedly lived in the sewers of Hampstead, feeding on the waste, growing large and blind in the darkness, never seeing the light of day.
The Toshers are long gone, but the rivers remain. They are the silent veins of the city. If you know where to listen, you can still hear them. Stand over a grate in Clerkenwell on a quiet night, and you will hear the rushing of water. That is the River Fleet, still fighting its way to the Thames. There is something deeply melancholic about these buried streams. They are a part of nature that has been completely subjugated by the city. They have been forced underground, turned into servants of sanitation, stripped of their names and their sunlight. Occasionally, urban explorers, the modern descendants of the Toshers, break into these tunnels. They bring back photos of Victorian brickwork that looks as perfect today as it did in 1860. They describe the sound, a constant echoing roar of water. They describe the smell, not just of sewage, but of old earth and history. London is a double city. There is the city of light, of buses and tourists and skyscrapers, and then, separated by a few feet of concrete and iron, is the city of water and darkness. The rivers are still flowing, waiting for the day the bricks crumble and they can rise to the surface once again.
In southern Poland, near the town of Krakow, there is a staircase. It is made of wood, and it spirals down and down and down. You walk 378 steps just to reach the first level. But this is only the attic of the world that lies beneath. This is the Wieliczka salt mine. For over 700 years, from the 13th century until 2007, men went into this earth to hack away at the grey rock. Salt, in the Middle Ages, was more valuable than gold. It was the only way to preserve food, to keep an army fed through the winter, to survive. So they dug a kingdom to find it. The scale of Wieliczka is impossible to comprehend. It is not just a mine, it is an underground civilization. There are over 180 miles of corridors, reaching a depth of over 1,000 feet. But unlike the cramped tunnels of Potosi or the chaotic maze of Odessa, this place was built with pride. It was built with devotion. The miners who lived and died here did not just take from the earth, they gave back to it. In the long, dark hours of their shifts, they began to carve. They didn't carve support beams or simple tools. They carved art.
The crown jewel of this subterranean empire is the Chapel of St. Kinga. It is a church located 330 feet underground, and it is breathtaking. Everything you see, every detail, is carved from salt. The floor tiles, which look like polished marble, salt. The intricate bas-reliefs of the Last Supper on the walls, salt. Even the massive glittering chandeliers hanging from the ceiling are made of salt crystals. It took 3 men 67 years to carve this chapel. They spent their entire working lives creating a masterpiece that the sun would never touch. The acoustics down here are perfect. The silence is heavy and absolute, broken only by the sound of your own breath. The air is cool and impossibly pure, free of bacteria, preserved by the very mineral they mined. It is said that horses brought down here to turn the treadmills lived longer than horses on the surface, their lungs pickled by the salty air.
But like all sunless worlds, the Elichka has its ghosts. The miners believed that the salt was alive, that the mountain had a soul. They called him the Skarbnik, the treasurer. He was the spirit of the mine, an old man with a long white beard, holding a lantern. He was a trickster and a judge. If a miner was hard-working and honest, the treasurer might warn him of a coming collapse or show him a rich vein of salt. But if a miner was lazy or whistled in the tunnels, which was forbidden, the treasurer would extinguish his lamp. To be left in the dark in Wieliczka was a death sentence. The mine is full of chasms, underground lakes of brine that are denser than the Dead Sea, and vast, empty caverns where a scream simply vanishes. There are legends of the White Lady, the ghost of a princess who wanders the saline corridors, searching for a ring lost in the deeps. Our journey through the sunless world ends here, in this glittering cathedral of grey crystal. We have travelled from the bone walls of Paris to the hidden cities of Turkey, through the misery of Potosi and the burning veins of Centralia. We have seen that humanity has a strange compulsion to dig. Sometimes we dig to hide, sometimes to prey, sometimes to escape, and sometimes simply for greed. We build empires of the dead and palaces of salt. We try to colonize the dark. But the dark always wins in the end. The tunnels collapse, the rivers rise, the fires burn on, and the silence returns. Thank you for joining me in the dreamscape of history. If you enjoyed this descent into the dark, please leave a like and subscribe. Until next time, keep your lantern lit and don't look back.